Alright everyone, welcome to the Things We Carry YouTube channel. I thought I'd go ahead and kick off this channel with a little folding knife review. This one of the ESEE collaboration Expat Medellin. Now this knife is designed through Randall's Adventure Training and through ESEE Knives in their new sub-brand, which is Expat Knives. So a little bit of different branding, but designed by the same people in the same kind of survival school. There's an interesting story to how this knife was created and the different iterations that went in before it got to here. So if you're just coming here for specifications, I'll go ahead and put in a little photo, a little spec chart here for you. You can pause that video and take a look at it, and then hang out for the rest of the video if you want to know how this was created. Now this is definitely not the first folding knife that Randall's Adventure Training collaborated on. That honor goes to the much loved and at this point legendary Ontario Rat 1. Now this is one of the older models, one of the original Ontario models, and it says Randall's Adventure Training. But if you look at the new models, they have a different logo. It has a big O and it says Ontario Knife Company, and there's no mention of the Randall's Adventure Training on the knife itself. That's because while Ontario still owns the Rat name, Randall's Adventure Training created ESEE Knives as their kind of their own brand and more premium brand as well. And that's just where the names differ. But this knife is still being produced. It was produced a long time just in this color. You can buy a whole bunch of different kinds of versions of this in different colors and different handle materials as well. But this one kind of kicked it off. Now, once ESEE Knives was created, everybody was waiting eagerly for a folding ESEE knife with the ESEE name, and there was a lot of talk about making this knife, the Azula, or in this case the Azula 2, into a folding knife. Now there were a couple of designs that came out, some CAD renderings, some 3D models of the design, but none of them went to production. One of them got close enough to end up at a trade show and even on the coming soon list for Blade HQ, but we never got a chance to buy it, and I was very sad about that. A few months later though, we got this. This is the ESEE Zancudo. Zancudo in reference to a mosquito, because at this point it was the smallest thing that they had produced, and it was kind of fitting. It was very cool to see a blade that actually had the ESEE logo on it. This one though was a frame lock. It's the first one they made as a frame lock. It's got a little Zytail scale on this side, steel frame lock on the other. All of these knives, the folding knives, are made in Taiwan, made out of AUS 8, which is a really nice budget steel. And while this has similar lines to the Azula, it really wasn't quite the same. Definitely looked very different than the mock-ups that we saw, than the CAD renderings that we saw. And shortly after coming out with this knife, they came out with its big brother, the Avista. Now, the Avista, this one looks a little different. It's got these bright screws here. I stole the screws from this knife, which were originally satin finished, put them on here, and then put the black screws from here on this, just because I thought it looked better on the handle. But when this comes to you, if this comes to you, it'll be with black screws. The handle of this knife is extremely reminiscent of the Ontario Rat 1. In fact, the entire knife has almost the same footprint when looking at it sideways, but if you flip it up, you'll see this one also is a frame lock. Now, once these knives came out, we thought to ourselves kind of, oh, you know, I'm sure they're not going to do a folding Azula anymore. And, you know, we kind of knew that that was on the back burner for a while, so we were just kind of content. And then they teased this knife, I'll roll on a picture, at what looked all the world like a folding ESEE 3. It was a big, robust, chunky looking frame lock, some pictures of it up next to an ESEE 3, and I was like, this is it. This is going to be the prototype for the hardcore folding bushcraft knife that ESEE is going to come out with. And then that also never happened. And then randomly, months and months later, we got this guy, which if you'll notice looks a lot like that mock-up, but instead produced in Taiwan overseas. Now that initial knife looks a lot like some of the stuff that Lion Steel has been producing for the DPX line, so maybe there was some politics involved in that. I'm not going to get too much into that, but I'm glad that we finally found a knife that looks like one of ESEE's actual existing models and is a folding knife. I consider this the big brother to the Zancudo more than I consider the Avista the big brother, because this just seems more like a take on the Rat 1 design. Now, now that we've got a little bit of that history out of the way, I can talk about the knife. Thanks for sticking with me for that. I just thought it was interesting. I've been following ESEE knives for a long time, since they split off from Ontario. And so anytime they come out with a new model, I read up as much on it as I can. I always get very excited about their new stuff. But my thoughts on this knife itself, I dig it. I really do. It's got some points I'm not super hot on, but overall, I really like the knife. This one is G10. It's the only folding knife they've designed so far in G10, and it's quite nicely textured. This reminds me a lot of the texture of some of Cold Steel knives. The old Recon 1 reminds me a lot of the AK-47's texture. Cold Steel does a good job with that, and they might even be the same supplier. Feels all the world like Cold Steel's G10. For reference, if I roll in a Spyderco Tenacious here, Spyderco has way finer texturing than this ESEE, or than this Expat knife. Now, while it is nice and textured, great ergonomics as far as the profile of the handle, the one ding I'm going to give this knife is I don't like how thin it is. It's way thinner, of course, than the Rat 1. And when this knife is open as well, this lock bar goes in, makes it even thinner right where it's contacting your finger, and that can create kind of a hot spot. When you have a liner lock, of course, you've got that liner in the way, so you don't lose any material here when the liner comes over. This knife, the Rat 1, I would say is a much better option if you know you're going to be doing a lot of cutting tasks for a long time. I've got decently large palms, so I like having a bigger knife, or at least a knife that's simple in its ergos, so my hand can kind of fill into there. Ontario did create a Rat Model 2, and it's the only thing that they still sell with the Randall's Adventure Training logo on it. And it's like almost exactly the same as this knife, just 30% smaller. They literally just shrunk the design, and unfortunately because of that, my hand doesn't fit in it. This knife, it's profiled to fit a hand about my size, especially when it's got this finger choil in here. And when they make this finger choil 30% smaller and they bring this jimping back, suddenly I'm holding the knife like this, and it doesn't quite work out well on the ergos. But other than its thinness, the only other ding I would give this knife kind of goes to maybe this particular example. Now, they have only been producing these for a little while. This actually says first production run on the back. But if you notice something interesting, if I can get here, I'll roll in a flashlight real quick. Knife open in the lock bar, you'll see a little bit of discoloration in there. And you'll notice if I close it, that goes away. It only shows up right at the tip of the lock face. If I hold up the Zancudo over here, you'll notice it doesn't have any of that discoloration. And that's not rust, that's actually heat bluing from the grinding of the lock bar interface right here. If I close it, you'll see what I mean. That's where the lock bar actually sits. That's this thing right here. And the lock bar, you'll notice, this thing is about 5 millimeters wide, but it's only contacting maybe about 2.5 millimeters up here. You can see the wear pattern that it brought into there. So this knife, I'm not sure if something happened to this knife in production or if it got a little bit wonky during the grind of it, but that is something that's kind of disconcerting. These liners are hardened through a similar process that the blades are hardened. They're not the same steel, but if the tang of the knife gets soft, you'll actually have this steel cut into there prematurely, and it'll start to wear your lock out. And the only other thing I don't like about this design is that since it is so thin, when I'm squeezing on it, you start to squeeze the lock further closed. It doesn't take much pressure to move that lock bar over. So again, through tasks that cause any kind of squeezing or torquing, you're actually mechanically wearing on that just with the pinch of your hand. So I think this is a great choice as an EDC knife. I actually carry this at work occasionally. I'll have this in my harness or in my pocket under the leg loop of my harness. It does carry very low in the pocket. It's the first one that designed by Randall's Adventure Training to have a low ride pocket clip. It doesn't seem to be quite as strong as the 3-hole pocket clips, or the pocket clips that seat down further up in the handle. Just because, of matter of fact, that it has a little bit less material here. They have to have a cutout so you can get a driver in to use the screws if you need to, and that reduction in material just means it's not quite as stiff, It still holds pretty nice, but again, this side being relatively polished or stonewashed, if you go upside down, it could fall out of your pocket. So I appreciate the fact that it is low ride. Now, another knife that this reminds me of actually is going to be the Spyderco Tenacious, just because they're both full flat grind. They have similar cutting edge lengths, both G10. Now this one is a liner lock, so it's a little bit thicker, but because it's got this big cutout to accommodate your thumb for your right hand, it's still decently thin on this section, so you can get a little bit of a hot spot in there, but this one also has a thumb ramp, so you're going to be putting a little bit more pressure up here and not quite as much pressure into the handle of the knife itself by squeezing it. Traction plan is pretty good on this. Like I said, I haven't used it on any big cutting tasks yet, but it doesn't look like it's going to fly out of your hand. Not something I would necessarily put into the role of tactical or even emergency tactical knife, just on account of the fact that it is so thin, and only time will tell how strong this design is at the pivot. This knife is fairly thin in its blade and thin over a long portion, so I'm not sure, if this went into something with a lot of force or possibly got twisted around, how likely that blade is to survive. You've got a little stress point right here where it's milled in from the grind, and I could see this notwithstanding a credible amount of stabbing tests. That being said, it's a great cutter. It goes through rope really well, it goes through cardboard really well, and it's still quite sharp. You can see it definitely shaves from the factory. And I touched that up a little bit, but this is pretty much the factory edge. So if you're looking for this knife, definitely go out and get one. I was only a little disappointed because of my bias towards ESEE knives. If I didn't have such a collection already of them, in fact, I just picked up the ESEE 4. When I hear ESEE knife, I always think, knife you can walk into the woods and chop a tree down with. And so again, I've got a little bit of a bias towards that. That probably skewed my perception of the knife coming out through here. But as an EDC knife or as a food prep knife, this large broad blade would actually do really well as kind of a folding chef's knife, especially if you're camping as like a mess kit knife. That would be a great idea. It's not serrated, so never ever let this touch a ceramic or glass plate, or metal for that matter. But using this on plastic or wood to do food prep, that's actually going to be quite a nice blade profile for you. And again, at 50 bucks, it's only a couple dollars more expensive than this one. This one runs in maybe about 35. You can get these for about 35. Now, they do sell options of these that are more expensive, but the general run-of-the-mill Zytel handled one is going to be right around that price point. You can get these for just under 50 if you really look for it, but again, it's the only one that has real G10. So I'm going to put some more use on this knife, see how it goes in a long-term review, but initial impressions, I like it. It wasn't what I was expecting, but I like it, and it cuts real nice, and so far the lockup is absolutely, bank fault solid, no blade play up and down, or lock rock side to side. So thank you all for tuning in. I'll go ahead and have links down in the bio where you can pick one of these up, and stay tuned for my next review. See you guys.